Hello everyone, this is Aleko from Icy Veins, and just this past week, we had an incredible Hearthstone World Championship tournament. There were so many great players that made so many great plays, and there are a lot of lessons that we're going to be able to take away from this tournament in future weeks, because the most amazing thing happened in Game 5 of the finals between Frozen and Tom60229. It's the highest pressure Hearthstone situation possible, right? The winner of this one game is crowned world champion. But what we get is a situation where the two players make fundamentally opposite mulliganing decisions. And it has to be said that this mulligan decision ultimately decides the game. And I mean ultimate in every sense of the word, because it has to do with one of the most controversial cards in Hearthstone history, Ultimate Infestation. And it leads to what we have to call one of the most controversial mulliganing decisions in Hearthstone history, because what happens in this Jade Druid mirror match is Tom60229 on the play keeps UI with no ramp spells in his hand, a play that I think a lot of us wouldn't do, but it wins him the game. On the other side of the table, we have Frozen on the coin, which is a better spot to keep a UI from, not keeping his UI. So what's going on here? I don't think there's a universe where both of these players are correct, right? Why would the player in a better spot to keep a UI not keep it, and a player in a worse spot to keep a UI keep it, and both of them be right? It just doesn't make sense. So who's in the right here? The Hearthstone community seems to be completely divided on this. I've seen a lot of support in favor of Tom keeping the UI, and I've seen a lot of players saying that you should just never keep a UI with no ramp in your opening hand. So let's dive into the numbers behind this, and let's also just take a look at the logic to see which player, Frozen or Tom, should or should not have kept Ultimate Infestation in their opening hand. Let's kick things off by taking a look at the difference between these two deck lists, because if these decks are substantially different enough, that could be some reasoning for why it would be correct for both players to make the mulliganing decisions that they did. So the key difference we're going to notice here is that we have two Violet Teachers as targets for Oaken Summons for Frozen, and two Ironwood Golems as targets for Tom. We're going to see two Mark of the Lotuses for Frozen, which play well with his Violet Teachers, in place of two Arcane Tyrants for Tom. And finally, one Innervate for Frozen, and we have one Wrath for Tom. So Frozen is running this Violet Teacher package to try to be able to have a stronger mid-game, play to the board a bit more, whereas Tom just has a intrinsically more defensive deck. He's also going to have stronger Ultimate Infestation turns thanks to those Arcane Tyrants, which means that it's probably a slightly better card or a slightly more important card in Tom's deck than it is in Frozen's deck, even though obviously it's still very important for Frozen as well. So that might be one reason that Tom is slightly more incentivized to hold on to UI than Frozen is. However, to counteract that, we see a much more aggressive Jade Druid list out of Frozen than we see out of Tom, which means that he might be left in a position, if he holds on to his UI, where he could get run over by a really aggressive Violet Teacher start. So we do have some incentive for him to keep it based on the way these decks are lined up, but we also have a very strong incentive for him to not keep it. But at the end of the day, I still think this is just fundamentally a Jade Druid mirror match. I don't think that the differences between these two decks are substantial enough to change what either of these players is really hoping to do, which is to ramp early, draw a bunch of cards, and then make larger Jades than their opponent. Anyone who's played enough Jade Druid mirrors knows that the person who gets ahead in the Jade count is the person who's probably going to win the game. So I think at the end of the day, when you just look at the deck lists and compare the logic between these two players' strategies, there's really nothing here that would make it correct for Tom to keep UI on the play and for Frozen to not keep UI on the coin. So if the logic behind the situation doesn't necessarily tell us who was correct or incorrect in this situation, what do the numbers say? How do the percentage points change if you mull or if you don't mull that one additional card? The tool that we're going to be using to calculate the probability that we'll be able to draw a specific card by a specific turn is something called a hypergeometric distribution, which sounds fancy, but it's really not very complicated, and it's something that card game players have been using for decades to calculate the percentage chance that they'll have a certain card by a certain turn. Really, all that you have to do is plug in the remaining number of cards in your deck, the remaining number of cards that you are specifically looking for within your deck, the number of draws you have to find that card, and then the number of times that you need to draw that card in the end. And this will spit out a percentage chance of that happening. This is complicated slightly by the fact that when you mulligan in Hearthstone, you are unable to redraw the cards you just mulliganed, but really all you have to do is just calculate two hypergeometric distributions, take the union of these two probabilities, and then you get the correct answer. Thanks to online calculators, we don't even need to do any of the real mathematical legwork, we just have to make sure that our variables are correct, and the online calculator will spit out the correct answer. So it's really not that bad to calculate the probability of having drawn a specific card by a specific turn, but when it comes to some of these more complex, compound questions, I'm just not really that well equipped to answer those. So when it comes to the really, really complicated math stuff, I'm probably going to be off by like 1, maybe 2 percentage points tops, because I'll be using an equation which basically ignores the mulligans. So I hope you guys can forgive me with this. I'm just a guy who's decent at children's card games. I am certainly not a mathematician. However, as I'm pretty sure you guys will be able to see, these small percentage points that I'll be off on the really complicated questions will fundamentally not really change the answer of who is correct and who is incorrect when it comes to this all-important Game 5 mulligan decision. The first set of numbers that we need to keep in mind really throughout this whole sort of numerical analysis process are the percentage chance that Tom finds Ultimate Infestation by the turn he would like to play it if he did mull it away. Obviously, he has a 100% chance of being able to play an Ultimate Infestation as soon as he can if he keeps it in his opening hand. But what's the chance that he will find it if he mulls it away right now? As you guys can see, Tom would still be favored to find an Ultimate Infestation by turn 7, which is when he did play that Ultimate Infestation in this game, if he mulled it away. He has roughly a 66% chance of finding a UI if he draws 3 additional cards, which is how many additional cards that he did draw in that game, and he has a roughly 52% chance of finding it with 0 additional draws. So that means this 34 to 48% chance of him not finding Ultimate Infestation was what Tom fundamentally decided was too big a risk to run. However, it obviously goes without saying that keeping a 10-drop in your opening hand is a risk in and of itself. So what we need to decide at the end of the day is whether or not it is a greater risk to not have UI by that crucial turn 7, or is it a greater risk to have a UI in your hand as you miss potentially other important cards that need to be played along the way to this very powerful 10-drop? The way I see it, there's really only 2 risks that Tom is running by holding on to this Ultimate Infestation. The first risk is that he does not find enough ramp, allowing Frozen to ramp harder than him and completely out-tempo him by playing his hard-hitting cards first. The other risk is that Tom doesn't find the defensive tools that he needs to be able to stymie an aggressive Violet Teacher mid-game. So let's start by taking a look at the percentage chance of him finding ramp if he does mull the UI and if he doesn't mull the UI. Basically, across the board, you can see it's an 8 to 9% chance increase that he will be able to find one of his ramp spells on curve if he does mulligan away the UI, which is pretty significant, especially when you consider that this is across 3 different cards. Now, that doesn't necessarily make this a 27% worse decision. It's just important to note that each of these cards, when played on curve, is substantially stronger than when it is played not on curve. The next thing to take into account is that Tom needs a relatively substantial amount of ramp to be able to play his Ultimate Infestation on the turn that he did play it in this game, which was turn 7. So he needs to ramp 3 times by turn 6 to be able to play his Ultimate Infestation on turn 7, so he can get that board advantage and that card advantage that he needs. As you guys can see, Frozen has a pretty menacing board here going into Tom's turn 7. He's got that Violet Teacher online, which can be answered without an Ultimate Infestation, but if there isn't an Ultimate Infestation played this turn, Tom would be going into Frozen's turn 7, where he could play his first Ultimate Infestation and get significantly ahead in this game. It's very important that Tom is able to ramp up 3 mana crystals by the end of turn 6 so he can cast his UI on turn 7. But what do the numbers say? How much more likely is Tom to be able to get that ramp if he mulls and if he doesn't mull? And as you guys can see, it's not that substantial of a difference, actually. He has a roughly 40% chance of being able to get 3 mana crystals of ramp by turn 6 with no extra draws without his mulligan. And with those 3 extra draws that he had this game, he has up to a 61% chance. So he's actually favored to be able to hit those 3 mana crystals. I've seen a lot of people say that Tom was very lucky to be able to have that wild Wild Growth on turn 2 and then immediately draw that Jade Blossom. And it certainly seemed to me at first glance that he was really lucky to be able to hit those ramp spells on time. But something like that is actually not only reasonable to expect, but more likely to happen than not. If Tom were to have mulliganed away his ultimate infestation, he's only increasing those percentage points by like 6% on the bottom end and like 4% on the top end, which is not a really substantial difference, especially when you compare it to how many percentage points he's giving up on having UI in his hand if he does mull it away in his opener. So when you look at all the numbers from a ramp perspective, it looks like Tom made the right decision in holding on to this ultimate infestation. However, we still have another thing to worry about here, which is the likelihood of an aggressive mid-game out of Frozen. So let's see how many percentage points Tom is giving up in that regard by holding on to his UI before we make any final conclusions. So for the sake of argument, let's just walk through what a dream aggro Violet Teacher start would look like for Frozen. That would be a turn 2 Wild Growth, a turn 3 Violet Teacher into Coin plus Mark of the Lotus, into a turn 4 Branching Paths plus maybe something like Innervate, or you can even throw another Mark of the Lotus in there. So what tools does Tom have in his deck to answer that kind of start? Well, when you throw the Branching Paths into the equation, plus the Mark of the Lotus, you're creating a 6/6 Violet Teacher now, which can plow right through an Ironwood Golem, so the answer is really nothing. There's no amount of mulliganing that Tom could or could not do to stop that dream aggro Violet Teacher start. So if Tom is concerned about that kind of start happening, it doesn't really matter if he keeps the ultimate infestation or not. He's just going to lose to that sort of sequence of events, regardless of whether or not he holds onto the ultimate infestation. So what really matters is a more reasonable Violet Teacher start. Something that, again, looks like a turn 2 Wild Growth into a turn 3 Violet Teacher plus Coin or Innervate plus Mark of the Lotus, but no Branching Paths to really give that extra punch. So if we concern ourselves with a more medium Violet Teacher start, all we really need to do is find an Ironwood Golem or an Oaken Summons that hits an Ironwood Golem to be able to stymie that aggression. Another thing that Tom could do is just have one ramp spell, either one of Wild Growth or Jade Blossom, and then play a Spreading Plague on turn 5. That would also give him the same opportunity to get to the late game to try to play those higher impact ultimate infestations. So what are the odds of Tom either being able to find that Oaken Summons into Ironwood Golem or Ironwood Golem by turn 4, or one ramp spell plus one Spreading Plague? And as you guys can see, his odds are pretty good of that happening, even with no mulligan. He's got a 65% shot at finding one of those. If he mulls, that goes up to about a 71% chance. That is a significant increase, but even that Wild Growth into Violet Teacher into Mark of the Lotus start is not super likely to happen and doesn't even guarantee in and of itself that it will kill Tom if he doesn't find that Ironwood Golem or a ramp spell or two and a Spreading Plague. It can certainly apply a lot of pressure, but Tom has other defensive tools in his deck that we aren't even talking about. He has Jade Behemoths, he has Malfurion, he's got plenty of removal spells, a swipe cleans up a board of 1/1s very cleanly. All of these things do a pretty good job at answering these moderate to slightly aggressive Violet Teacher starts out of Frozen. So it just doesn't seem like a great game plan for Frozen to bank on having one of these starts in the mid game, which just completely runs over Tom. At the end of the day, Frozen is still playing a Jade Druid deck. These Violet Teachers don't transform his deck into an aggro deck all of a sudden. Yes, they do give him, in some low percentage scenarios, the ability to really leverage a mid-game advantage, but as you guys can see, the numbers show that it's very likely that Tom, mull or no mull, is going to be able to find the defensive tools he needs to give him the ability to survive into the late game, which is where Tom has an advantage thanks to his superior ultimate infestation turns with his Arcane Tyrants. So when we go back to those very first numbers that we looked at, the percentage chance of Tom having an ultimate infestation in his hand by turn 7 if he mulled away his UI and his opener, I just don't see these 4 to 6% increases in ramp efficiency and in defensive efficiency adding up to that major risk that Tom is running of not having his ultimate infestation by turn 7. I have to say, when I started making this video, I was totally expecting to have the numbers be in support of Tom mulling away that ultimate infestation. When I saw this play happen in real time, my intuition was that he was taking on a huge risk. But that's just not what the numbers are saying, and I have to admit, it seems like on the play, even against an aggressive build of Jade Druid, the numbers speak very clearly. Keep Ultimate Infestation. Now, of course, there are other builds of Jade Druid out there. These guys are on Oaken summons, and some people might be running Jade Spirits, which is a way to get ahead in the Jade race and really punish players who hold onto greedy cards, but that's not what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with a specific matchup between these two decks, and I think it's very clear that the numbers say keep UI. Now, if Tom, the player on the play against a more aggressive build of Jade Druid, should have kept his Ultimate Infestation, then the numbers all say that Frozen, the player on the coin, really should have kept his Ultimate Infestation in this game. Now, there's several things going here which make it even more favorable for Frozen than for Tom. The first of which is the coin. This guarantees him 1 point of ramp, so if he doesn't hit one of those wild growths that he needs, but he does hit that Nourish, he'll still be able to play UI on turn 7 and draw into all those Jade cards, which can start to build up a board advantage. The other thing is that Frozen is getting one additional card, so if you kind of set aside one of those Ultimate Infestations in his hand and throw away the other 3 cards, all of that math that we did for Tom is basically the same for Frozen with those 3 cards. He even had 2 Ultimate Infestations in his opening hand, which means that if he held on to one, he would be guaranteed not to draw the second one, at least in his opener. So when you add all of these things up, I think what you get is a situation where Tom clearly was in the right to keep his UI, and Frozen was in the wrong to not keep one of his. When you take a look at the way things shook out, and you see that Tom on the play was able to play his UI on turn 7, and then you go to Frozen's turn 7, where he would be able to play his UI, but he didn't have one in his hand, if Frozen had a UI in that spot, he would have been in a great position. He gets to kill the 5/5, get a 5/5 of his own, get some card advantage, kill the Fandral with one of his 2/2s, and all of a sudden, we're looking at a spot where Frozen is the one that has board advantage, Frozen has some slight card advantage, and anything can happen in this game going into the late game. Instead, what we have is a situation where all of those advantages are going for Tom because he was able to play a UI and Frozen was not. Now, I will be the first person to admit that when I started creating this video, I was totally convinced that Tom was wrong for holding on to his Ultimate Infestation, and that Frozen was the one who played correctly, and he just got unlucky for not drawing his UI. But that's just not what my really crappy math shows. It seems like you run a much greater risk in the Jade Druid mirror matchup by not holding on to UI, because the deck is just so redundant. You have 6 ramp spells, you have plenty of defensive tools, and you're just likely to be able to find those cards, whereas you only have 2 Ultimate Infestations in your deck, and if you don't find one of those on time, you can get very punished. And that's exactly what happened to Frozen, and that's why he lost the match. So congratulations to Tom. I think he made the right decision in the finals, and now you're our world champion. So thanks for watching, guys.